Hi, this is Dr. Vicente, and I'd like to welcome you to Educ7101, Managing the Challenges of Educational Change. Our course is situated within a very specific context, a 21st century context. Let's take a look at what Alvin Toffler, the late author of the renowned bestseller Future Shock, says about the 21st century. In this quotation that he is attributed to him, what we can really glean from the lines is the ability of individuals and institutions to be able to change. The words that Toffler uses are learn, unlearn, and relearn. As we continue this course, we will explore the dynamics, the definition, and the determinants of change, particularly in an education context. In order for us to fully appreciate this course, we need to take stock of its design principles. Firstly, our course uses the flipped classroom approach. If you've had a chance to take a look at the detailed course outline, you will notice that within the 13 weeks, our face-to-face meetings for those on the internal classes happen only 8 times the entire semester. For the rest of the time, we will be adopting a flipped classroom mode. For those in the external study program, well, it is really a flipped classroom mode. What will happen is that I'll be preparing short videos during the weeks, and I invite you to undertake activities either as individuals or by your groups as you continue undertaking this course. The other design principle is communities of practice. As I mentioned previously, I'll be inviting you to undertake activities each week, and preferably you should be doing this in teams or in groups, what I would refer to as communities of practice. I'll explain this further as we go through the assessment tasks for the course. The third design principle is the idea of reflective practitioners. And here I'm using Donald Sean's idea or concept. Our goal is for all of you undertaking this course to embrace some of the features of becoming a reflective practitioners. Finally, I see myself as a critical friend, your critical friend. In other words, I'll be providing you with stimulus, provocative questions, and the idea is for you to succeed in your quest to learn more about education. In this image, you will see myself and a very influential scholar in educational leadership, Professor Christopher Day. In my projects, in my publications, in my research, he is my critical friend. He provides me with valuable inputs, critical points and suggestions, and in so doing improves my work. Some things about your critical friend in EDU 7101. As I said, please look at me as a critical friend. I will be offering critiques of your work, particularly in relation to your assessments. And really my role is to be an advocate for the success of your work. I see myself as a critical reflective practitioner. Many years ago, I was a school teacher in Spain, in the Philippines, my home country, in Australia, of course, where I'm living now, and in the United States of America, and in Indonesia. These were the places that I have been a teacher. And in part of my earlier teaching and research in relation to education has provided me one of the advocacies that I am fighting for until now, the idea of sekama or burnout. So this is something that I'm really interested in, burnout of teachers. I also am very much interested in networks of reform. Later, after completing my stint as a teacher in various contexts, I became a school principal in the Philippines, principal of a primary school and a secondary school. And in this leadership position, I realized that it was very important to embrace reform, and one of the most potent ways I saw for reform to be implemented was through networks of government, private, and different types of stakeholders working together in order to effect change. Another area that I'm researching on is corruption and its impact on human services such as education. This is something that I continually study and research about within the area of education. I also see myself as a critical ethnographer. In other words, I essentially seek to change what I see are injustices in society, what I refer to or what is described as wicked problems. I'm a political scientist by training, and I see myself as someone who embraces critical ethnography. These are some of the books that I have done. The first one talks about corruption and implementation in a Philippine context, and my latest book, published just last year, is entitled Mapping the Terrain of Education Reform, Global Trends and Local Responses. So as you can see, educational reform is very much part of my research agenda. Now let's take a look at Educ7101. In your ECP and in the Blackboard, you will notice that the course is divided into three broad themes. Theme 1 is what is change. So for theme 1, we will have 4 weeks dedicated to this. The first week, this week, is a welcome week where you get to know more about what this course is, the design principles, the assessment tasks. Week 2 will talk about reflections in relation to educational change. Week 3 looks at issues and challenges. Week 4 looks at the notion of structure and agency. As you reflect on the various readings that you will be exposed to in theme 1, I'd like you to consider this question. How do you see yourself in periods of change? In other words, is there any change to your identity? Or how does your identity react to changes that happen around your context? The second theme for this course looks at change itself, particularly how we analyze change. So the second theme of the course is divided into 4 weeks. Week 5 looks at policy, processes, and practice. Moving on to contexts, interrogating reform, and finally looking at wicked problems. If you can see, week 5 is highlighted in green. This is the due date for your first assessment, which is a community of practice activity. Essentially, what's going to happen in week 5 is I'm going to ask you to prepare a 1-page outline of your assessment 2, which is due in week 7. The 1-page outline will essentially be your plan for assessment 2. And what's going to happen is that you are going to share your plan to your community. You will be obtaining feedback from the members of your community. You will also obtain feedback from me because I'm going to read that outline. And hopefully, feedback that you get from multiple individuals, from multiple sources, will inform your assessment 2, which happens in week 7. So this assessment would be, if you take a look at your ECP and your Blackboard, you will realize that it's a literature review. This is due on week 7. The COP first assessment task is about 10% of your total marks, whereas the second task, the literature review looking at change in education, contextualizing educational change, consists of 30%. The third theme looks at the relationships between leadership, which is what this specialization is all about, stakeholders, and change. It's divided into 5 weeks. We begin with comparative perspectives, leadership and education reform and outcomes, and then 2 successive weeks in which we look at education reform and stakeholders. Similar to theme 2, on week 10 will be your third assessment task, another COP activity in which each one of you will write, once again, a 1-page outline of what you intend to do for your final assessment, assessment 4. And again, everyone is encouraged to provide productive critical feedback on these one-page outlines. I will also provide feedback. Hopefully all of these multiple pieces of information and feedback you get, you'll incorporate as you finalize your case study, which is due on the final week of the semester. So let's talk more about the communities of practice that you will be undertaking for this particular course. So the image that you see here will be, of course, myself right here with the name tag, and the gentleman right beside me is Etienne Wenger, the author of Communities of Practice, the one who actually thought about it. And as we learn and actually practice COPs in our course, we need to recall that there are really three elements there. One is mutual engagement. And I'd like you to take a look at the highlighted text that you see on your slide. Members establish norms and build collaborative relationships. And this is termed mutual engagement. As you build your communities of practice, this is an important component that all of you should experience, creating mutual engagement. The second component would be for members of the COP to create a shared understanding of what binds you together. And this is the joint enterprise. Of course, the joint enterprise will be the activity of providing feedback to each other's one-page outline, and eventually a shared repertoire, the third component. The community, your COP, provides or produces a set of communal resources, which is termed the shared repertoire. As you build networks, relationships within your COP, I encourage you to use discussion boards, various modes of communicating with each other, and in so doing strengthen your COP. Now, for this first session, I'd like to invite you to become reflective practitioners, right? And I'll be undertaking a very simple exercise in which we will try to find out whether you as educators have a clear knowledge, understanding, or maybe if you have the pulse of young learners. So I actually have three main questions, and the first one is this one. What do you think is most important to the happiness of young adolescents? And when I talk about happiness, I actually am referring to Aristotle's definition of what happiness is, the highest good. So for this exercise, I present you this particular slide. There are 25 items here. And what I'd like you to do is to carefully select what you think would be the top 5 items that a typical young adolescent will select. 5 items from the 25 that you think would make a typical young adolescent happy. So my suggestion is, while you're looking at this presentation, pause and then select what you think would be the top 5. Let's say that you've already selected, you've paused this presentation, have selected. Let's take a look at whether what you've chosen correspond to what in my research has emerged as young adolescents' preferences for what they think will make them happy. In this slide, you will see that the top 5 starts from the idea of being filial, respecting oneself, being a loyal citizen, loyal to the company one works for, to have a sense of meaning and purpose in life. In year 7, 12 to 13 years old, these were the top 5 scores. We did an empirical longitudinal study that covered about 30,000 respondents. Longitudinal means we tracked them, and in the second year, we see that the ranks have changed a bit. To respect myself was number 1. Number 2 was have a sense of meaning and purpose in life, to have a sense of achievement, to be filial, to make my own choices. So my question to you is that were the items that you chose, the top 5, were they similar to what young adolescents say when asked this question? I'm willing to bet that your top 5 may not be identical to the top 5 that the respondents in this research project that I undertook. You can see the source here. I dare say that there could be some disparities in what you chose as the top 5 items that you think young adolescents will choose to make them happy compared to what young adolescents actually chose as reflected in the findings of this survey. Now, these items that we did, this is a continuation of the items. Now, usually people would say that whether people think I'm cool or being known as a popular student would be one of the top 5s. But in this survey, as you can see, being known as a popular student is number 22, and whether people think I'm cool is actually the last one. Now, what happens if we rearrange the data? If we rearrange the data and then take a look at some theoretical perspectives, particularly from Bandura, from Betts, from Hogan and Donovan, the data that we generated basically tells us that the respondents that we had could be defined in 3 types of characteristics. We had young adolescents who manifested traditional ideals. 32.7 of the responses reflected this. Majority really reflected modern ideas, and then the lowest reflected what we would describe as postmodern. So traditional would refer to family, to ideas of getting work, of country, loyalty. Modern talks about individuality, sense of agency, while postmodern speaks about image, this idea of coolness, of creature comforts, of devices. So in the context that we looked at, the data that I presented to you, as really an activity, an exercise in relation to reflection, what we see here are an interesting configuration of young adolescents in a particular context. Well, the second question I'd like to ask you now is, well, what is to you your idea of the value of education? Let me rephrase that. Let's again imagine young adolescents. This is going to be the same sample that I used for this, and as you can see if you observe closely, this is from a different context, not Australian, but actually a Singaporean context. And what I'd like you to continue thinking about now is, if you take a look at these items here, identify what you think would be the top 3 items that the young adolescents will say is the value of education. So I invite you to pause this presentation, carefully choose what you think will be the top 2 or 3, and then once you're ready, you can turn on again this presentation and move on to the next slide. So this next slide tells us what the findings are. If you notice, we looked at primary 4 kids, and longitudinal study means primary 4. We tracked them when they became primary 5. We tracked them when they were secondary 1 and then secondary 2. This was a 3-year project. And I can safely tell you that when the primary 5 kids became primary 6 and the secondary 2 became secondary 3, we saw a continuing trend. In primary 4, doing well in exams was the most important. Or this is what young kids thought was the value of education. When they became primary 5, it was getting a high-paying job. Secondary 1, getting a high-paying job was the value of education. In secondary 2, it remains the same. Now, a bit of context. We did this research in Singapore while I was still working with the National Institute of Education. I was there for a decade in Singapore. As a political scientist, I was looking at this idea of citizenship. And so we did this massive survey among young people. One of the issues that Singapore encounters is the idea of emigres, individuals who are leaving the country, not because of poverty, but because they have the wherewithals to go somewhere else. Now, the findings from this particular slide is indicative. are really indicative to the probable reasons for the low registers of citizenship and the phenomenon of people emigrating from Singapore. At a young age, we argue that we seem to have instilled on the young people the idea that the importance of education is getting a high-paying job. So when they grow older, we again say that what is stopping young people when they become adults from leaving Singapore if they are offered a more lucrative job in another country? So we're saying that as early as primary 4 or primary 5 in particular, education's value is really very instrumental in this particular context. Now, the third thing that I'd like to share with you is this idea of new economy competencies. This is what is described as 21st century knowledge and skills that young people have. So they range from interpersonal skills, inventive thinking, work-related skills, knowledge management skills, and self-regulation. Now, what we did in our study was we essentially measured the young person's 21st century competencies. These are the ones reflected here in this particular column. And then we correlated these with tests that they undertook in English and in math using, well, we contracted the University of New South Wales in performing this English and maths test. And as you can see, we were able to derive correlations. And if you are familiar with quantitative research or even statistics, you will remember that correlation values that are higher than 0.30 are really those which indicate a possible relationship between items on this column and items on this column. For example, if you take a look at this slide, you will immediately see that this particular correlation coefficient, which is statistically significant, you see the asterisks there, the correlation coefficient is 22, meaning that the 21st century competency of social and leadership skills is correlated with UNSW English tests. 22 is the correlation coefficient. 16 is the correlation coefficient between maths and social and leadership skills. Unfortunately, when you take a look at correlations, these are really pretty low, to the point that you might even say that really nothing is happening between this item here and this particular column here and this column there. If you take a look at the entire slide, you actually don't see correlation coefficients that are larger than 0.30. If we continue the list of new economic competencies right here in this column, work-related skills, self-regulation, knowledge management skills, and the so-called scores in English and mathematics, again, you will see that there are very low correlations. Now, what do these two tables tell us? Well, the Singapore education system invested heavily on preparing young people for what they refer to as 21st century knowledge competencies. But what our findings are telling us is that the current practice of prioritizing English and maths subjects does not in any way correlate to students acquiring 21st century knowledge competencies. Said in another way, you can say that if students score high in English and in math, this has no bearing whatsoever with 21st century knowledge competencies. Said in another way, you can argue that you don't need to be smart in relation to English and math to be able to possess high measures of 21st century knowledge competencies. The implication here is the testing system that is heavily ingrained in the Singapore education system. Continuing this rigid testing system alongside the desire of the nation to have 21st century knowledge competencies seem to be incongruous. Now, when we presented this to the Ministry of Education while I was still there in Singapore, this really caused quite a controversy because we were actually questioning the very foundation of the education system of the nation. Singapore's education landscape is really a very interesting thing to study for one reason. The stability of the government is unique. Since Singapore became a modern nation in the late 50s until the present, we've seen really one single party that's dominated politics, which essentially means that there is policy continuity. Unlike in other contexts, like for example in Australia, you see a shifting of political party dominance. And the implications to this is, of course, changes in education policy. In Singapore, that does not happen because there's been one singular political party that has been in power, which makes the study of educational change fascinating. As you can see, as I said a while ago, they're moving towards student-centric values-based education system. In 2015, just 2 years ago, Singapore emerged as the top performer in PISA in science, maths, and English. They were the best performing nation of all the participating PISA nations. But at the same time, our research tells us that if we prepare young people for 21st century skills, this preoccupation for test scores, particularly in maths and English, and even in science, they don't contribute to acquiring 21st century competencies. For the first week, I invited you to take a look at the article of Larry Cuban, Reforming Again, Again, and Again, and also the review of Anne Weaver Hart of Samuel Bacharach's book, Education Reform, Making Sense of It All. I hope that you've had a chance to read these articles because it basically ties in with the things that I just shared with you in relation to the Singapore education system. Reform seems to be producing paradoxical results. And Cuban talks about how reform sometimes, instead of experiencing progression, goes into retrogression. As you read these two articles, I'd like you to look at these three questions that I've written below. How does the author, choose one author or both authors, define change? In your interpretation, what are the barriers and enablers of change? In your interpretation, what is the impact of educational change? If you notice, these two readings that I've asked you to try to do in the first week are actually not that difficult, but as you go through the course, the degree of difficulty, the complexity will slowly increase. As you reflect on what we just experienced, this conversation that we've had for the first session in Educ7101, I'd like you to take a look again at the ideas of Donald John, the reflective practitioner. Reflection in action, response to a surprise. What surprises did you encounter today as you listened to this presentation? Reflection on action invites you to look at reflection or reflecting after the event. What are your own hunches that seem to resonate with discoveries, surprises that you encountered today in this particular session? What were some of these tacit knowledge or experiences that you've had, and have they been somehow touched upon, or do they resonate with some of the ideas that I shared with you in this introductory lecture about education reform and the specific example that I have provided you, the case of the Singapore education system? Finally, as you continue your learning journey with me and with your community of learners in the Educ7101 course. What would you like to explore and investigate further as you reflect about change? Now, this is what reflective practice is all about. The capacity to reflect on action so as to engage in a process of continuous learning, which is one of the defining characteristics of professional practice. That's the end of our first session. I hope that you were able to get some insights, some new knowledge, and if you have any questions, my email is right there. Please feel free to communicate with me.